to Soul Food Coffee House in Redmond, Washington. Yay! And I'm Rick Levine, your guide for the month of May 2019. We've had a pretty crazy ride this last month, and we will untangle a little of that astrologically, cosmically, and we will look ahead at what's coming up for the month of May. Before I jump in, I want to very briefly touch base on a couple of things. I will be at the Boston NCGR, that's the National Council on Geocosmic Research. I will be at the Boston NCGR chapter on Saturday, May 4th, and at ncgrbostonastrology.org. I will post the link below here for you YouTubers. And I will be doing an all-day workshop on a fresh look at interpreting charts. So I don't know why I'm telling you this. I'm not. I'm telling everyone out there who may be in the Boston area. The Memorial Day weekend, Astrology's premier regional conference is in Seattle. This will be my 29th year of attending this conference. I've spoken at probably about 25 of them. And this year I will actually be doing a pre-conference workshop on Friday morning, May 24th, on becoming a better astrologer, the theory and practice of improving chart consultations. That's on Friday, May 24th. And NORWAC, the Northwest Astrology Conference, is that Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and there are workshops post-conference also on the Thursday before and the Friday after. It's a fantastic event. It's usually about 300 or so astrologers, a faculty of about 20 people from around the world. Some heavy hitters are brought in to add a little spice to us local, lunks that we are. It's like, I don't know who said this, but some advertising guy said that if you want to make something sound important, make it sound like it's come from far away. So, so here I'm on my home team, I'm a homegrown, but I just, as you may know, got back from a lecture tour that took me from Belgrade to Istanbul to Lisbon, and there, being from far away, you're an automatic hit. You don't even have to do anything. You just, and they were all fantastic conferences, and I know a lot of you are watching here, and it was great meeting so many people who actually come here every month, via YouTube, and it's very, very strange. Anyhow, Memorial Day weekend, even if you can only come one day, it's a fabulous event. People do come from all over the United States, even from out of the country, just to come to this little regional weekend event. It's a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and I will be there in full battle array. I'm doing one of the plenary lectures for one of the meals, and plus the pre-conference, and like I say, it's me on my home team. After that, the middle of June, I will be in England for a few weeks, and I will be lecturing at the AA conference, that's the Astrology Association of Great Britain, up near Cambridge. And the following week, and that's the week before the solstice, so it's the week of like the 15th, and I don't have the exact dates, but check my Facebook page for further details. But not only will I be lecturing the weekend before the solstice at the AA conference, but I'm going to be doing lectures and workshops in Glastonbury and Avebury on the day before the solstice, because I will be down at Stonehenge for the solstice. But on Thursday, I'll be doing an all-day workshop at a place called Element Bookstore in Avebury. And so anyone out there in that neighborhood, check it out. That information is coming together as we speak. Midsummer, I have my annual summer retreat at Brighton Bush. There are postcards down here for anyone who wants it. This is putting astrology to work in your life, thinking cosmically while acting locally. Many of you have heard me talk about Brighton Bush before. It's just a gem, a magical place in the Northwest. If you've never been there, even if you don't make it to my workshop or retreat, this is a 5-day, it's a Sunday night through Friday, so it's a 5-day retreat from July 28th through August 2nd. Even if you don't make it there for my event, make it your business to go there. It's like one of the coolest places in the world that I've ever been to. This event does sell out every year, and so if you're interested in it, check it out early and get a reservation in, because it is limited and it does fill. And then the last thing on my agenda will be the big NCGR conference in Baltimore on Labor Day weekend. I'm mentioning that in passing. I'll have more about that later on, but I will be lecturing there too. And then the highlight of my year will be doing a workshop, a week-long retreat workshop in Bali. It'll be my, I think, eighth retreat in Bali. And it's called Pragmatic Mysticism and Applied Divination, Astrology as a Living Guide to Being Better Players on the Team of Creation. And I will be sharing this with the awesome and legendary Caroline Casey. If you don't know Caroline's work, check it out on either on YouTube, on patreon.com. Caroline has had a weekly radio show on Pacifica Radio for years, maybe decades, and we find it interesting, she and I, that we are doing an astrology retreat, but neither one of us calls ourselves astrologers in our marketing stuff. I mean, I refer to myself as a wizard because I always think that astrology is only one of the tools in my bag of tricks, and she refers to herself not as an astrologer, but as a creative visionary. So we had a little bit of a chuckle over that. Anyhow, that's the year for me. That will be on November 8th through the 16th. And this event will also be limited in its enrollment, and it is already filling up. It's been announced. So if you're interested in this, check it out online. Grab one of these postcards on the table here. There's a link with a complete day-by-day curriculum online. If you have any questions or want to talk to me about it, I'd be happy to talk with anyone, either on the phone, on Skype, telepathically, whatever works. And now I've exhausted what I'm doing in the months ahead, which brings me back to the proverbial here and now. So, we are recording this on Wednesday night, April 24th, which is the last Wednesday of the month. It won't go live on YouTube until closer to the beginning of the month, but I want to actually spend a few moments talking about what went on last month so we can better understand what we will be aiming at over the month ahead. I think, and I've said this before, both here on my monthly forecasts, and also for those of you who are Patreon supporters, at $3 a month you get a mid-month update, and I went into this much more this month on my mid-month update, but I want to just touch base and review it now. And by the way, Patreon is www.patreon.com/Rick Levine, and that's where you have access to a wide range of not only my monthly, but my semi-monthly, my not quite weekly cosmic quickies, a monthly online how to do charts webinar, and other things. So that's your place there. And if nothing else, go there and become a solar supporter at $1 a month. because as you know, these are free, and one of these days I'll have enough supporters at $1 a month that I'll actually have a second camera and a video person. That's up to you. Throw some money at me, I'll make it back at you. All right. But in my April mid-month report, I spent a bit of time talking about what I want to talk about now. And what I want to talk about now is Mercury and Neptune, because we've had enough. Many of you know me well enough and have heard me talk enough times about how retrogrades, I think retrogrades are largely misinterpreted. And I always like to remind everyone that a planet goes retrograde when it comes closer to Earth, which means the planet is louder. And so it's when the planet energy is amped up, it often reaches a point where we can't handle it. We shut it down, just like an autistic child or a hyperactive person basically medically is given Ritalin or an amphetamine-like substance, which amps the energy up and then it shuts down. And hyperactive planets that are retrograde get shut down similarly. So the planets aren't negative, it's just that there are a lot more to handle. And for those of us who practice planetary Aikido, I just made that up, the amped up energy is not something we resist. It's something that we take in and we dance with and we use, which means that retrogrades, rather than being negative, can be very powerfully positive. Now, I've been saying this from this pulpit for years. However, it's nice to know that the universe can still humble me with a Mercury retrograde from hell, which is kind of what we just had. And although I personally had a hard time with it, and I'll save you my crazy stories. Actually, I'd be happy to share them, but not from here. Can't waste that time here. But it did involve loss of internet for over a week and a bout with the IRS and a fraud from the Social Security Administration and power being shut off because of bill. I mean, you know, the list is crazy. That's just the tip of the list. This past Mercury retrograde was different than other Mercury retrogrades because it's rare that a Mercury retrograde gets to the 29th degree of a sign and then turns retrograde. It's like so close to getting to there, wherever there is. Because that degree of, 29 degrees of every sign is considered to be a critical degree because it's unstable, because it's ready to change. But a case could be made for the fact that the 29th degree of Pisces is the least stable sign or point because it's actually ready to change and start an entirely new cycle. And so we had Mercury that moved into Pisces and raced through Pisces, lined up with Neptune, which is in Pisces for 14 years, for a 14-year stay, as it does once every 165 years or so. Mercury lined up with Neptune. Mercury lining up with Neptune alone is a bit of confusion because it's rationality of Mercury and no boundaries, no logic, just imagination of Neptune, but it's in Pisces, perhaps the most boundless and imaginative sign. And so Mercury then reached the 29th degree, couldn't quite make it to the satisfaction of that 0 degrees of Aries and starting something new, and instead it started doing the moonwalk. Can Mercury do a moonwalk?
Probably.
If it was Michael, it could. Mercury began to shuffle backwards. And as it did, it just deepened that Pisces uncertainty and lack of clarity and what is real. And as it backed up, it backed all the way up to its conjunction with Neptune, which it did almost 3 weeks prior. And then through the last week of March and through the beginning of April, that Mercury before it turned direct at the beginning of April. Mercury is direct now. Matter of fact, Mercury is whooshing its way through Aries, building momentum. But as that Mercury backed up and lined up with Neptune for the second of 3 times, then it began to slow to do its retrograde to direct turn. And remember, when a planet turns retrograde or direct, it is moving slower than it moves at any other time in its cycle. Why is that? Because like a pendulum changing direction, it doesn't just change direction and gain regular speed. As it's coming up, it slows, and then it stops, and then it starts moving very slowly and gains direction, and it's at the middle of the cycle where it moves the fastest. What that means is that Mercury hung out conjunct Neptune forever. I mean, for a day, for another day, for another day, for a week and a half, almost 2 weeks. Mercury was I think we could make up another word, circum-Neptunian. It was doing this kind of dance around Neptune, just hanging out. And then it took another couple of weeks for it to gain enough speed to get the hell out of Dodge. Out of Pisces. So, interestingly enough, the timing of the release of the Mueller report and then the real release of the Mueller report corresponded with Mercury turning stationary retrograde and then Mercury turning stationary direct. And I said from this stage last month that even with whatever happens that was going to be, I felt, important toward the beginning of April, that we won't know crap until we get to the very end of April, because it's not even going to, normally when Mercury turns direct, we begin to get some forward motion. And I said in the mid-month update, in a much deeper dive, I said that when Mercury turned direct, there was no satisfaction, there was no clarity, there was no forward movement, because it was still under Neptune's influence, meaning that it had one too many martinis to drink, because Mercury doesn't do well when it's confused. And Mercury, Neptune, now granted, this can also be a great work of art and imagination. There is a positive use of Mercury, Neptune in any aspect. But clarity is not one of them. All right, so what this means is that even when Mercury turned direct, and even when it began to escape from Neptune, it still was in Pisces. And it didn't leave Pisces, and we're going to pick up here with the chart. I realize we are still in April, but here we have, back in April, we have Mercury at 17 Pisces, and we have Neptune at 17 Pisces. This is at the beginning of April. Mercury is just turning, it's just turning direct, and Mercury now is at 18 Pisces by April 4th, but still within a degree of Neptune. But even still, as that Mercury moves on, Mercury doesn't leave Pisces until right there on April 17th, April 16th, April 17th, and that was when we had the release of the Mueller report to the public. Obviously, regardless of what political spectrum you may be a part of, the fact is that we were told one thing and we got something else, which often happens with Mercury and Neptune. In fact, the older textbooks that are not as kind to Neptune, talking about its spiritual and imaginative aspects, the older books all associate Neptune as one of the one of the disasters of the cosmos, because it's about delusions. And so there's that whole thing of the what is real, that occurred. But what I had said and what reality bore out is that even with Mercury direct, we would not have any clarity until Mercury moved into Aries, which it did on April 16th, April 17th, Mercury entered Aries. Now, we still had Venus hanging back in Pisces, and the fact of the matter is that Venus didn't leave Pisces until April 20th, which now brings us up to the last week of April. Here we are on Wednesday night, the 24th, but we're going to move this pretty quickly to May 1st. But we can see here now that we have Chiron, which had been in Pisces for years, has entered Aries. Venus has entered Aries. Mercury has now entered Aries, is now moving through Aries, and it will pretty quickly. So the energy is very different. And I apologize for that long prologue, but oftentimes we can't see where we are unless we know where we've been. Although that can be taken to a fault, Marshall McLuhan called it rear-view mirrorism. And he said that often culture, society, governments, people drive into the future by looking through the rear-view mirror, when often what's ahead of us has nothing to do with what's behind us. But knowing what's behind us is important because we are on a trajectory. But we can't get hung up thinking that what's behind us is what's in front of us. And that's why we need to know that the month of May is different than the month of February, March, and April, where wherever we looked, we couldn't tell whether we were looking ahead or behind or to the side because we were driving under the influence. And now we have reached a point where things are becoming more clear.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. So let's look at the chart for May 1st and talk about what's coming up on the month ahead, because I know more often than not what is said from this stage is, oh my God, the month that's coming up is like nothing you've ever seen. Well, this month is like everything you've ever seen. I don't want to say it's boring. It's not boring. There's no such thing as boring when you have all the planets moving around and doing their dance. I mean, it's always new and it's always different. However, we don't have any significant activity from outer planet to outer planet. What do I mean by that? As the planets move around, the moon moving around once a month, and Mercury and Venus and the sun moving around the zodiac approximately once a year or so, and Mars once every other year. It takes almost 2 years for it to go through. It takes Jupiter 12 years to go around once, so it moves substantially slower than any of the inner planets we've described so far. And then when you get to Saturn, we're talking closer to 30 years, and Uranus 85 or 84 years, and out to Pluto, which is almost 250 years. The slower the moving the planets involved in any aspect, whether it's culturally, mundane, world astrology, or whether it's in our natal chart, the slower moving the planet making the transit, the longer the transit lasts, the more powerful the transit is over time. The faster moving transits make something happen that is more, I think of it as acute versus chronic. You know, it's like you can have a terrible headache for 20 minutes and then feel great. And yet for those 20 minutes, you could have felt like shit. That's acute. That's like a lunar transit. It happens and then it's done. Of course, a lunar transit, though, happens for 20 minutes every month. But it's a different rhythm than a Pluto transit coming and it basically moving into the neighborhood, and then it moves into the spare bedroom in your house, and then it moves into your bed. And then for a year after that, Pluto's not in your bed, but it's still making coffee in your kitchen, you know? And so these slower moving planets create events that are longer lasting, deeper rooted, and have greater impact over time. Often when we do this kind of astrology, we look ahead, whether it's for a week or a month or a year or a decade, and we go, what are the slowest moving transits of that decade? For example, we've just recently come out of the 2012 to 2015 period where we had Uranus making a 90-degree angle or a square to Pluto, which is a rare aspect, and it lasted for years, and it created a lot of social turmoil around the planet. We don't have to dredge through that one again right now. The next big event, and for many of you who have heard me talk about the year ahead, you know that I've been saying that the most significant event in 2019 is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 2020. Now that sounds like a contradiction in terms. The exact Saturn-Pluto conjunction occurs on January 11th, 2020. But throughout this year, these two slow-moving planets come relatively close together, then they come very close together, and then, I should say now, but we'll say then one planet turns retrograde and the other turns retrograde, and their distance begins to separate, and then each planet turns direct again, and the faster moving Saturn by January 11th, 2020 will catch up with Pluto. Now, what we are looking at right here is a chart for May 1st. And I'm drawing a circle around three objects that are players in this, and they're players this month, but there are no exact aspects, and yet there's still the underlying piece of what's going on in our lives and certainly in the world politics. And the circle is around three things. Pluto is at 23 degrees of Capricorn. Saturn is at 20 degrees of Capricorn. And the south lunar node, the south node of the moon, is at 20 degrees of Capricorn. Now, the lunar nodes move backwards the complete cycle every 18 years. And they're almost like karmic openings, if you will. Some people refer to the lunar nodes as Maya, which in the Hindu tradition, Maya is a Sanskrit word that means the veil of, well, it's not really the veil of illusion, but it's the veil that prevents all of us from seeing reality as it really is. It's the veil that's created by our senses, our reality tunnel, our cultural conditioning, our ego, and so on. And it's when that veil is removed do we see true nature, or do those who are enlightened see true nature. Regardless, the nodes of the moon are real points. They're sometimes called the eclipse points because the nodes of the moon are created by the moon going around the Earth and the Earth going around the sun, and where these two orbits intersect, it's like two ripples on a pond, circles on a pond meeting. Where they meet, they create an anchor point. The word node is just Latin for knot. It's like reality ties itself up in a knot. In fact, things that are physical, whether it's a table, a piece of granite, a building, or your fingernail, anything that has physicality is basically made up of empty vibrating space. And the illusion of physicality is created by nodes. And the nodes are high frequency at hundreds of trillions of a second waves that are crisscrossing with each other, creating knots. And those knots are the nodes of what appears to be real. The reason why we're talking about this is because the nodes, which are always one opposite another, it's a line that defines in effect a plane. If you have two pieces of paper and you somehow merge them, they crisscross in a line. And the nodes represent that line. Where the moon cuts above the orbit of the Earth around the sun, that's called the north node. And then where it cuts below it, north-south, that's called the south node. And in astrology, the nodes are directional in as much as it is thought that the north node in some way represents where we're heading, and in some way and in some way the south node represents where we've come from. So it's almost like the North Node is sometimes considered the purpose of the soul in this incarnation. And the South Node in some systems is considered to be our past lives, if you will. And this is a simplification, but it's important to just get a little bit of understanding of this because it's not something that I normally talk about in depth. And yet this month it's really a key to understanding why the events with no exact outer planets are still so overwhelmingly important this month, not only, again, in the outer world, but in our inner worlds. Oh, they're the same. Never mind. So we have the South Node, which in some way represents the past. The South Node, in Hindu, in Vedic astrology, the South Node is considered to be a trap. Well, they're both considered to be traps in Vedic astrology because they're both about the veil of illusion. In Western astrology, we say South Node bad, North Node good. South Node is the trap of where I've been, what I've done, what I'm good at. Freud had this concept called infantile regression, which basically meant when the shit got crazy, we became babies. He would not appreciate my interpretation of infantile regression. But it's under pressure. Under pressure, we go back to a point in our life that felt safe. I mean, we just do this automatically without thinking about it. And the South Node, in some ways, is that kind of a point. Because it's a point of mastery that can be really important. But if we go there every time it gets difficult going ahead, we're not getting ahead. We're not doing the work of the soul. We're not doing what it is that we're supposed to do, whatever that means, during this lifetime. So right now, the South Node is at 20 degrees of Capricorn, which means over the past month and a half, Pluto moved across the South Node, and Saturn, because it's moving faster and sneaking up on Pluto, Saturn right now is conjunct, is within a half a degree of the South Node, which in a way is opening up a wormhole into all of our karmic debts, if you will. It's recycling the past, but as a hard lesson to learn. And at the same time, we have Saturn creeping up on Pluto, and it's within 2.5 degrees here, because Saturn is at 20 degrees Capricorn in 30 minutes. That's 20 and a half. So it's 20 and a half, 21 and a half, 22 and a half to 23 is 2.5 degrees. So there's about 2.5 degrees between Saturn and Pluto, which in most anyone's astrology is close enough to call it a conjunction. Those two planets, even though they're not exact, they are close. And they have been close all year. I mean, Saturn, if we go back a month or so, Saturn was back a couple of degrees. So they've been within 5 or 10 degrees for a bit. And that Saturn and Pluto will continue to get closer. Pluto just turned retrograde. Pluto turned retrograde, well, it's stationary. It's turning retrograde today. Saturn follows, and it turns retrograde on April 29th. So by May 1st, both Saturn and Pluto are retrograde, but Saturn is retrograde faster because it moves faster than Pluto, and so these guys have come as close together as they're going to get until next January. What that means is that what's going down now is like foreshadowing for what the more serious issue is when it's more serious when it hits next January. Now, I don't think we're ever going to back fully away from it, even though the conjunction widens a bit. We are now in a period of time that occurs about every 33 years, give or take a few years, because remember, Saturn takes 29 and a half years to go around once. But in that amount of time, Pluto's moved a bit further, so it takes Saturn 29 and a half years to get around to where it was, and then another 3 or 4 years for it to catch up to Pluto. You can track this Saturn-Pluto alignment like clockwork going back to the crucifixion. It's not usually an easy period of time. Some good stuff has happened throughout the ages because it happens 3 times every 100 years. I mean, crazy stories, and I don't want to go deep down this. I will keep touching on this throughout the year because this is not a theme just for May. It's a theme that is around in April and May, but will be with us all the way through through December, January, February. It won't be until March that it begins to dissipate. But when Saturn and Pluto aligned in 1834, I think it was, that was when the British Empire made slavery, abolished slavery throughout the entire British Empire. And at the next time they aligned in 1865, that was the post-Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. So again, it's not all bad. Oh, and then again in 1965, which was the Civil Rights Act. So it was 65 or 66, I don't remember. So it's not always bad. However, there was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction within a week of the shooting of Archduke Ferdinand, which kicked off World War I. There was, within the week of the British Empire giving independence to India and Pakistan, that was within a week of that Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 1947. Now, we think, oh, that's a wonderful thing. It happened without a war. Mahatma Gandhi demonstrating peaceful resistance, basically took down the most powerful empire in the world. Cool, but we forget that 500,000 people were killed over the next year or around that period of time in battle skirmishes between the Hindus and the Muslims in control of who gets Kashmir, and the fact that it was not as peaceful as we would like to think. Again, I could, and I do have lectures on this topic specifically, but it's a very, very, very powerful, crazy, fascinating dive into how events just keep cycling around again. I mean, just another little flavor. It was on a Saturn-Pluto conjunction that Muhammad took Mecca and declared it the state of Islam, and then 150 or so years later, on a Saturn-Pluto conjunction, the Moors invaded Spain and took it from the Catholics. And then 700 years later, the Moors were kicked out of Spain by Queen Isabella in the 1200s, and it was reclaimed for the Catholics, and the Arabs, the Moors, the Muslims were pushed back into Africa on another year when there was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Do you see the large scale here we're talking about? There are so many events that weave in and out of this, and incidentally, in the fall of 2001, Saturn and Pluto were like at their full moon cycle, halfway around, and that was September 11th. That period of time was a Saturn-Pluto opposition. We're now at the culmination of that cycle, and that's the conjunction, and that's the background astrological piece that's feeding the clash between different perspectives, because that's what Saturn creates boundary. That's Saturn's job. Saturn's job is to create reality by creating boundary. It creates, and there's Bruce Lipton's fascinating work that discusses about how consciousness does not arise in the brain or at a cellular level in the nucleus of the cell. Consciousness arises at the cell wall. Because that's where the decision of self versus not self is. That's where, if there's an ego that has self-identity, I have to have a boundary. Saturn is that boundary. Pluto dissolves, now that's Neptune dissolves. Pluto transforms boundaries by deconstructing them and reconstructing them on a different level. So when I'm fighting my own tongue, that sounds awful. When Saturn, I was going to say when Plattern and Pseudo, when Saturn and Pluto line up, there's always boundaries that are rubbed up against and new boundaries are created. It's not an easy process, but this is where we are. And in May, the underlying piece of May is that Saturn and Pluto are just turning retrograde, which kind of sets a marker. And that marker is, this is as close as they're going to get for now. And so we're going to watch the planets as they unfold and the events that have occurred over the past weeks as we've come out of this mist of illusion and began to see a layer of clarity. And there's people don't know where they're going or what they're doing with this clarity, to the extent that there's incredible denial. I mean, to me, can I go here? Yeah, I don't care. No, I care. I don't mind what your political belief is, but I'm not surprised by anything that's come out in the Mueller report for those people who have actually taken time to read it. Can't pretend to have read all of the unredacted material, but I've read pages and pages of it. I've read enough to actually have read it for myself. What I don't I'm not surprised by what's in it. What I'm surprised at is that apparently, and I'm using the word apparently intelligent people can read the same document and the document is printed on black paper and people can say, yup, it's a black paper document, and some other people can look at the exact same document and say the paper's pink. Now, I don't understand. I mean, on some level, I do understand it. It's called denial. But it's, to me, that's the, my brain is literally day by day hurting over how can we do this? How long can we sustain this? Because it is unsustainable. And yeah, that's enough for there. So that's a rabbit hole that we won't come out of for a while. But what's important to understand is that it's tied to this whole Neptune in Pisces. It's tied to the Mercury retrograde dance around it. The planet's now moving into Aries. This sense of clarity, but we don't have. It's been said that the document is a roadmap. But no one knows how to follow it yet. And I think that it's the Saturn-Pluto energy that's getting us close to this next breakthrough, whatever it may be. Positive or negative, pleasant or unpleasant. I'm not predicting where any of this is going, because it's all way too strange for me to think that I have a sense of the trajectory. However, I know it ain't done yet, and I know that the Saturn now separating from Pluto is part of this culprit. All right, and again, although there are many dates and that we want to get to in a moment, I'm always of the belief that it's better to have one big thing that we can understand rather than have 300 dates and not remember any of them. This is the big thing for the month. Saturn and Pluto are turning retrograde, or have just turned and or are turning. Jupiter is also retrograde, but all the little planets, the Mercury, Venus, and Mars, are going forward, and so it feels like we're moving into new territory, and we are, but we have this deeper, it's kind of like standing in the ocean when the tide is coming up, and yet the undertow is pulling you can feel it pulling out. It's more complex than just one rhythm. Astrology is cycles within cycles within cycles. So we open up May with a square between Mercury, having moved into Aries, and Mercury is 90 degrees or square to Saturn and then to Pluto on the 2nd. Can you see right here? Here's Mercury at 21, almost 22 degrees by the evening of May 1st. But earlier in the day, it's at 20 degrees, if we backed it up a few hours. And then by the end of Thursday, May 2nd, that Mercury, which is moving rather fast, is at 23 degrees and it's square Pluto. What this means is that the Mercury, which as clear as we think it is in Aries, the impulse of jumping to the conclusion, this is what's going on, this is where we are. Mercury in Aries is fast. Mercury in Aries is like a machine gun. I own a Mercury in Aries. And for those of you who have heard me lecture enough, you know that when I get excited, I don't have periods or commas or semicolons. I'm just going to hit the next word one after another, and it looks like I don't even take a breath, and sometimes I don't. Mercury in Aries is like machine gunning, rapid fire its way into the impulsively. However, on May 1st and May 2nd, that Mercury runs into a problem. It runs into a square to Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn, and that says structure. That says the authority. This is the setting of, which is already, I think, set up. It's the setting of the boundaries that we're pushing against, whether it's in Turkey, where I just spent a week with their situation with Erdogan, or whether it's in England with their situation with Brexit, in Venezuela, or in this country with the battle of who's in charge, where is Saturn, what is the authority, and when Pluto meets up with Saturn, that which is the greatest authority, this is Nietzsche 101, sometimes called nihilism, that which is the greatest authority, that which is at the top of the mountain, disintegrates and falls to the bottom of the mountain. It's God is dead. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that is an example of how something that reaches the peak and then it has to recycle. And in a way, the authority, the moral authority that we're seeing at the top of some of these mountains is part of what's going on with this Saturn-Pluto conjunction, especially as Mercury now is squaring it. But Mercury is not as strong as Saturn and Pluto. So the facts don't, I don't want to say they don't matter, but the facts are and will continue to bump into these more intense and powerful energies of Saturn and Pluto. And actually over the past couple of weeks, if we ran this back two weeks, we would have the Sun at that same degree, and the Sun squaring the Saturn and Pluto, which was also part of the whole setting up of this squaring off between the branches of government in the United States. So this is how the month kicks off. We do get a little bit of all through the month, good news, bad news, which is confusing because it's like, make up your damn mind. Is it good news or is it bad news? Because what's happening is you can see here that Saturn and Pluto are at 23 degrees of Capricorn. Jupiter is at 23 Sagittarius, and that means that each and every planet that moves through that 23 degrees of Aries point, whether it's Mercury today, Venus in another week, because Venus reaches that point from about May 7th through about May 9th. When any planet reaches that point where Mercury is right now, it's going to run into a roadblock with Saturn and Pluto, and yet it's going to run into a trine with Jupiter that says, yeah, but the philosophy says it's all okay. This is how it's going to work out. This is where it's going to go. Jupiter, all the legal authorities are saying this can't happen this way. But it is. That's because it's square. To see the square and the trine working at the same time, that's what's going on, and that's another background flavor that we have through the opening weeks of May. As we get to May 4th, the moon moves into Taurus. Let's back that up a little bit. Take this an hour at a time. Well, I just want to inch that moon up so it doesn't jump ahead. and that's close enough right there. The actual new moon in Taurus on May 4th occurs at 3:45 p.m. That's Pacific Daylight Time. That's 6:45 p.m. Eastern Time. And this new moon in Taurus is interesting because it's kind of boring. Now, it's, we look at it. We look at any chart, especially a new moon or full moon, and we go, "What is it aspecting?" Well, this 14-degree point of Taurus is really not hitting anything else in the chart. It's widely trine the Saturn and Pluto, and it's coming into it. So this is actually an important piece of it, but it may take a few days for it to fully develop, because over the days ahead, and you can actually do some very simple math here, because this is at 14 degrees, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, that's 6 degrees. The sun moves about a degree a day. So about 6 days, about May 10th, is when the sun will square Saturn. Give it another 3 days and it'll be squaring Pluto. At the same time, that sun, as it hits that 23-degree Taurus point, is also going to be aspecting Jupiter, but now it's going to be an annoying quincunx. And so we can see that this moon in itself is rather uninterfered with. And that is actually, I think, useful on a Taurus full moon. So the significant thing about the Taurus new moon is this. It's largely unencumbered by other aspects, and all new moons are the beginnings of cycles. It's the start of the new cycle, it's the seed. And in Taurus, it's an earth sign, it's Venus related, and so the seeds that we plant are actually material seeds. These aren't like in Aries, the seed we plant is a new idea. In Gemini, the seeds we plant are having to do with motion and adaptability. And in Cancer, they can be an emotional seed. In Taurus, it's practical. There's the sense of this first week of May and at the new moon in May, we are charged cosmically with coming up with something in our lives that is practical, that we can take a small step on ritualistically, because all the prayer and incantation in the world is not a substitute for greasing the path for the planets to express themselves by doing something physical, by actually doing something. This is why ritual can be so important. And the ritual here on this Taurus new moon is really a ritual about doing something solid in your life, something that has real, pragmatic, down-to-earth meaning. Now, there is a little bit of a problem, and the problem involves Mars. Although the moon is largely unaspected, Mars is in an opposition to Jupiter, and it's in a quincunx to the Saturn and Pluto. And what this means is that Mars in Gemini, Mars is in Gemini, and Mars in Gemini, it's not that it's unhappy. Mars stays in Gemini until May 15th. Mars in Gemini can be a bit scattered. Mars in Gemini can be kind of like, let's do this, let's do that, let's do this, let's come back to this, let's do that, let's not do that. Does anyone here own a Mars in Gemini in their natal chart? Okay. Well, it can be Mars in Gemini, even more. Aries Mars in Aries is great at starting things and not as good as following through with them. Mars in Gemini is great at starting a lot of things, not just one. Now, so the problem here in this new moon chart is that Mars is opposite Jupiter. Well, what's Jupiter? Keywords, anything.
Bigger, better.
Bigger, better. Bigger, better, more. Jupiter's the magnifying lens. So if you got Mars in Gemini that is scattered, fragmented, running all over the place, and what's Jupiter doing? Jupiter's going, yeah, more, go, do it. It's like hyper enthusiasm, which can be very powerful if we harness it and put it to work. That's what we need the new moon in Taurus for. That holding it down and giving it ground. The other thing is the Mars in Gemini is also quincunx to Saturn and Pluto, which kind of makes it awkward as far as knowing how much to force, how much to push, how much to direct, and how much to go do something somewhere else. Because there is a value to doing a little here and then a little there and then a little somewhere else. That can be a very useful technique. So this new moon is not a huge new moon, but it is significant because of the Mars and the Mars-Jupiter and the temptation to overdo and overamp. As we move on a day at a time, we're back to an hour at a time. As we move on a day at a time, we can see a couple of things. Number one, Mercury, moving toward the end of Aries, moves into Taurus, and that occurs on May 6th. Normally, when a planet moves into Taurus, like the Sun did this past week, normally when a planet moves into Taurus, it does that. It re-gauges its center of gravity and it stabilizes itself so that it can determine where it is and where it's going and it gets there. If Taurus is in motion, its center of gravity is reclaimed while it's in motion. You can see gymnasts doing this. They don't stop to find their center of gravity. They're reclaiming their center of gravity as they're moving. Taurus can do that also. Normally, when a planet moves from Aries into Taurus, like the Sun did back on the 20th, 21st of April, hold on one second, where's my list? Yeah, and like Mercury will do on the 6th, and like Venus will do on the 15th, because Venus in Aries will follow Mercury into Taurus. So over the course of a month, we've had 3 planets, the Sun, then Mercury, then Venus. The Sun back on April 20th, Mercury on May 6th, and Venus on May 15th, one at a time move into Aries, looking for that stability of Aries to find what? Uranus. Uranus, for the first time in 84 years, is in early degrees of Taurus, while these planets are moving into Taurus. So this was the first alignment of the Sun and Uranus in Taurus in 84 years. Actually, in 84 minus 70, in 78 years, or whatever that is. As Mercury moves into Taurus on May 6th, it will then join up with Uranus on May 8th. As Venus moves into Taurus on May 15th, it will join up with Uranus on May 18th. So those 3 days of the planet moving into Taurus, and then maybe even a day or two after that, because even now today we had the Sun line up with Uranus exactly yesterday, day before yesterday, but it's still close enough that things are still a little crazy. Mercury moving into Taurus wants that stability, but it's not going to find it until a few days. So it lines up with Uranus on May 8th. It won't be until May 9th, 10th, or 11th until we finally begin to feel that Mercury stabilizing in Taurus. It's going to be a little bit crazy. Great ideas, lots of thinking, lots of data coming and going, but we won't know. It's not that we won't know what's real. We won't know what is important because the next great idea or crazy idea will come in so quickly. And right behind that, then we have Venus doing the same thing and there's Venus on May 13th, 14th, May 15th, Venus moving into Taurus right there, and then another 3 days later it lines up with Uranus. And so we have a lot of this interplanet activation of Uranus. Now again, this is not an outer planet thing like the exact conjunction of Saturn and Pluto. These are more like acute things that will last a few days, but they're faster inner moving planets that are making a repeating pattern with Uranus that in some ways is giving us a flavor and a taste of what the next 7 years may be like with Uranus and Taurus. Remember, Uranus just moved into Taurus back in March, and so it's only been in Taurus for a couple of months barely, and it's going to be there for 7 years, and so it's going to take a little bit for us to get a sense of what that Uranus and Taurus is going to be about. I want to back this up just a couple days back to the 11th, because on the 11th we have another series of things happening as the Sun first, and then Mercury, and eventually Venus all move through that 20, 21, 22, 23 degree point, and that is one at a time. They will, starting with the Sun, make a trine to Saturn, stabilizing things, creating good, solid structure, reality checks. But then the following day, quincunxing Jupiter. Whoops, did I step too far? Did I take this idea too far? It's just like too much. And then a couple days later, it's settling back into the reality of what's changed as the Sun trines Pluto. Now that same sequence of a planet trining Saturn, then quincunxing Jupiter, and then trining Pluto is going to happen again as Mercury does that, and actually, let's see, we have Venus coming in on the right around there, around the 8th, 9th. Venus, what does something with, on the 9th, Venus trines Jupiter. There's a sweet energy, but at the same time, it squares Pluto. So again, this is the good news, bad news. It's like there's opportunity, there's follow the feelings, make this bigger, express yourself, but it's also squaring Pluto, and it's like, whoops, something came out that now I got to deal with that may change things. So again, it's good news, bad news. But I want to move on to get to later in the month where Mercury, there we go, around the 16th, Mercury hits the trine to Saturn. Now we're getting news that's not fake. It's like, no, I mean, because Mercury trine Saturn is, again, it's the reality check, but now it's not with the Sun, with life, with energy. It's instead with facts, and those facts are grounded. And so things that we learn on May 16th are in fact fact. By the following day, that Mercury is then quincunxing Jupiter, which again, this is the theme for the month, is that first it's real, then it's like, well, maybe it took it too far, maybe it was too much, and then a couple days later, that Mercury, the day later, that Mercury will trine Pluto, and so that's the same thing. This is through the middle part of May. At the same time, right in here, we have, and I mentioned this earlier, we have on the 15th, we have Venus moving from Aries into Taurus. And again, when Venus gets into Taurus, it says more Uranus. Uranus is a bit of a, it's the fly in the ointment all month because it just doesn't quite let us settle. Last month it was Neptune, it was confusion. Now it's electric awakening awareness. What are we going to do with this next round of information that we get? See the difference though? I mean, there's a distinct energetic difference. And then by the 17th, 18th, Actually, early in the morning on the 18th, Venus lines up with Uranus. Desires are amped up. We know what we like, and what we like is not anything that we ever liked before or what anyone ever thinks we should have liked, or, it's like we're out of the box. It's time to like things that are different and or crazy making. Now, right around here, we now have the sun moving from Taurus into Gemini, right alongside Mercury. So Mercury now is Mercury is direct. It's catching up with the sun, and when Mercury direct lines up with the sun, it lines up on the far side of the sun. When it's retrograde conjunct the sun, it lines up inside the sun. And so, although this is Mercury lined up with the sun in its own sign, Mercury's at home in Gemini. So Mercury and the sun move into Gemini on the 21st. There's a full moon on the 18th. We'll go back to that in just a moment. But that 21st, Mercury and the sun move into Gemini, Mercury's sign, and they line up. But Mercury is almost so far away, and it's almost like it's hidden by the sun. The communication is used to get out there, but it's not as easy as it seems like it. No. It's not as easy as we think it should be, because Mercury is so distant, and it's reaching out. It's reaching far away. Let's back up and hit the full moon here. The actual full moon is at 2:11 p.m. 2:11 p.m. Pacific time. That's 5:11 p.m. New York time. So on May 18th in the afternoon, the moon opposes the sun. They are in exact alignment. Remember, aspects to the moon are what's important. And here we have, because the sun has recently, or is in fact just ready to line up with Mercury, this full moon is opposite Mercury. But the full moon is opposite Mercury in Taurus before they move into Gemini. And so it's almost like by the middle of the month, by May 18th at this full moon, we need to bring something into fruition. We need to, even if it means pushing a little harder to get something to happen. Because on the day after that full moon, the moon moves into Gemini, and then within a couple of days, the sun and Mercury both move into, the moon moved into Sagittarius, and within a couple of days later, both Mercury and the sun move into Gemini, and the energy scatters. So the full moon is like a culmination, and the culmination of the seed that we planted at the new moon on May 4th, it's like something needs to be harvested. This is a time of full awareness, and it's important that we take something at that time from what we've done before the energy begins to dissipate, which it will begin to do in the days that follow. As we move closer to the end of the month, Mars becomes active for a couple of days. On the 22nd, Mars, and I mentioned the day, but let's actually hit the actual. Mars moves from Gemini into Cancer. There we go. On May 15th. So the middle of the month, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of action, a lot of change. And Mars moving into Cancer is interesting because even though Mars isn't as effectual in Gemini as it might be, Mars in Cancer can be effectual, it just hates being there. Why? Because Mars is Aries sign. It's at home in the sign of Aries. Mars wants to go. Mars wants to push outward. Cancer wants to be protected and be inward. Cancer is the home and the family, and it's the mushy part of us. It's the part of us that that is safe when we're within whatever the boundaries are. And so Mars in Cancer can be very powerful, but it doesn't do a good job of going out and aggressing or asserting. Mars in Cancer does a great job of defending. And so we can see as Mars is moving in through Gemini, Mars is moving through Gemini now, we can see a lot of energy towards people spinning a lot of wheels, again, politically. But when that Mars moves into Gemini, you're going to see some things go quiet. It doesn't mean they're going away. It's just the energy is going to pull in because the battles are going to be fought a little bit more cautiously and a little bit more for keeps on home ground rather than looking like there's flashy sword fights like in Gemini. You know, there's the interaction is where the action is. In Mars in Cancer, where the action is beneath the surface. It's like going to a lake and seeing it absolutely placid, and you have no idea of the drama that's going on beneath that lake. That's Mars in Cancer. And that occurs, Mars moves into Cancer on May 15th. We also have the 16th and 17th, Mercury picking up on the trines to Saturn and Pluto, so we get some stability there. We want to move back ahead past that full moon. Toward the end of the month, I started to say that around the 22nd, Mars in Cancer actually picks up on a sextile to Uranus. And that sextile to Uranus can be a high energy few days where things that are happening, again, unpredictable. Who would have thought that? But we can see some pretty significant movement. Even though Mars is in Cancer, it's being acted on by wild Uranus during that particular time. We get to May 29th, we hit Mercury hitting a square to Neptune, and it's like all of a sudden we're back in March and April. Mercury, and now this is an acute headache. This won't last more than a day or so, but when Mercury hits that 18, 19 degree point of Gemini and it squares Neptune, stuff that we were trying to decipher back in March and April when Neptune was aligned with Mercury are now going to be back at odds with it, and we might find whether it's the same issues or different issues, things come up again and we need to deal with them. Last thing I want to mention is on the 30th and on the 31st, we kind of have a double whammy from Venus making a sextile to Neptune and a trine to Saturn. Here's Venus down here in Taurus making a trine to Saturn and then a sextile to Neptune. And in fact, over the first few days of June, it will then make a trine to Pluto. This is very powerful from a standpoint of love. Of values. Values. Sometimes we think of Venus as money, and it is. We think of Taurus as money, and it is. But it's also those things that we value. Whether it's, capitalist values or family values or environmental values. And so this might be, toward the end of May, a point where those energies are really grounded with Venus and Taurus knowing what she wants and hooking up with stabilizing, structured, hardworking Saturn and the dreams of Neptune, but in a positive way. It's a sextile to Neptune, and basically then going deeper even in her trine to Pluto. Very powerful end of month. However, we can overdo it. And the overdue comes here from the Mercury in Gemini as it squares Neptune. I mentioned that already. But Jupiter, which is retrograde, is backing into a square with Jupiter. This is a longer lasting, slower theme of 2019 that began the beginning of the year. In June it will be a topic because Jupiter squares Neptune for the second of 3 times in the year. But at the end of May, Mercury whizzing through Gemini, just kind of gathering data, not even caring whether it's useful or valid. It's just collecting information, and it squares Neptune and it can't figure out what's real. And then it opposes Jupiter, and it's like, again, it's too much. Overstepping bounds. and needs to pull in. So May ends on a bit of a flurry of activity that is very different than kind of some of the more steadier motions through the month. And at the same time, we also have that Venus stabilizing with Saturn. I think the last few days of May are going to be really important. I'll revisit this again in deeper, in a greater depth in the mid-month report. But I just want to end by just recapsulizing the fact that the mists of illusion are clearing. And yet what we see and what we get is different than where we're going, because we're not quite sure where we're heading with all of it yet. And yes, I mean politically, but I also mean individually. In life decisions that we're making, it's going to take, on many of the bigger decisions that we're all making in life, it's going to take until that Saturn-Pluto conjunction is fulfilled and on until 2020, until we get a real clear sense of what the heck went on this spring and this summer. So my suggestion is to keep moving forward, pay attention to that Taurus energy, keep that center of gravity, and if you feel confused, pull the energy back into the present moment and say, where am I? What didn't I understand last month in the mists that I'm now beginning to get clues with today? But don't try to force the issue on where you're taking the energy yet.